Hello and welcome back to another video today here again on Forza Horizon 5 with the third stage in our 1950s Mexican rally. So if you haven't seen part 1 and 2, they went up at the same time the last couple of weeks, so you might want to go and check those out first to give you an idea of what this is like, and so you know where we've got up to with the cars and what points they're on. But to recap, for those of you who have seen those, or if you haven't seen those and you want to start with this video, all the cars in this championship are built to the top of C-Class, so to 600 PI, with standard drivetrain and engine, a bumper delete and bonnet straps if they're available, full-width off-road tyres, fully increased track width, race transmission parts, race brakes, rally diff, off-road suspension, race weight reduction, race anti-roll bars, and the rest of the PI made up from engine upgrades. So let's take a quick look at the 4 cars that are tackling this week's stage. We have this Morris Minor with 195 width tyres all round, putting out 109 horsepower and weighing in at 647 kilos. We have this Porsche 356 with 225 width tyres all round, putting out 113 horsepower and weighing in at 736 kilos. We have this Ford Anglia with 195 width tyres all round, putting out 130 horsepower and weighing in at 673 kilos. And last but most definitely not least, we have the biggest and most powerful of the 4 cars, the Jaguar Mark II with 225 width tyres all round, putting out 220 horsepower and weighing in at 1,221 kilos. Now before we get started with the first car, let me run you through this week's stage. So the stage the cars are going to be taking on this week is the Playa Azul Rally, which starts south of Playa Azul out on one of the big tarmac roads, goes across a little dirt section into the town itself, before finding its way out onto the beach and into the jungle section to finish up. So the only change over last week is before any of the cars tackle any of the stages, I have quickly done 5 test runs in a completely separate car that isn't any of these, built to the same class but also rear-wheel drive. So something that handles fairly similarly, just to give me a bit of practice, rather than the first car being disadvantaged by me learning the stage with it effectively. But we are still going to be running in championship order to give, well, the car that's lowest down the most chance by being the one I run last, because I've had slightly more practice at the stage, which means starting up this week is going to be the Morris, because it's currently leading the way on 14 points. Let's see how it gets on this third stage. So away we go in the Morris, which is currently leading the way on 14 points after finishing 3rd and 1st in the previous 2 rallies. Straight off onto the dirt section, onto the big banked corner, which you have to brake slightly for, and then sort of tip the car around, down in 2nd gear for this hairpin and onto the tarmac again. So I did, unlike the previous 2 rallies, run this 4 or 5 times in a similarly built car to the same class, rear-wheel drive, similar width tyres and all of that business. So I have had a little bit of practice and got my runs down to sub 2 minute 50. Round this corner I actually got up onto 2 wheels, which I've not had before, a bit of a grip roll I guess, because it's not got a lot of power but has got a lot of grip as we go back onto the sand down this narrow street of Playa Azul here, as we get onto the brakes for the hairpin. Ran a bit wider than I did in practice. It does seem to have a little bit less grip. My practice car is quite a lot more modern than these, but nicely through here and across the road onto the sand section again. This braking zone's always difficult. The brakes on the Morris weren't quite as good as I was expecting after again doing it in a slightly more modern car, although these are race brakes so they should be reasonable. Back on to the dirt again after crossing that road. This little chicane is interesting. Try not to bounce onto the outside. Again through here, you have to sort of tip it through and get it lined up onto here. Nice long straight section here. That is a bit of a theme of this stage. It has got some longer high-speed sections, so potentially cars with more power and, well, potentially cars with a bit more power will do a bit better. Bit of a slide as we transition onto the tarmac, and again round here, huge kick of oversteer. Back onto the sand and down towards the beach, which you can kind of straight line a bit. I mean, supposedly I guess you follow the tyre marked road, but all the cars I'll be doing the same, just taking the straight line here. Again, a huge, long, straight section. So the top speed, well, kind of acceleration and speed, mid-range to top speed of the cars will come into play a bit here. As we get into this narrow bit down into the village, which is a little bit tricky. Had to lift there, which was flat previously. Mind the rocks on the inside, but turn in enough to get the checkpoint. Had to lift slightly through there again as we run down the final straight through the jungly section towards the finish line to complete the first run in the Morris Minor. So the Morris sets a benchmark time of a 2:49.486. Let's see what the Porsche can do. And away goes the Porsche, slightly up on power at 113 horsepower, but also slightly heavier than the Morris at 736 kilos. Heading away nicely here onto the first dirt section. Got it tipped in nicely through here. It did feel, again, a lot more stable, the Porsche. It does have the slightly wider 225 width tyres over the 195s on the Morris, which does seem to make quite a big difference in the corners. That's something I'm really noticing here that previously haven't compared cars that directly with the two different widths. But nicely through here, managing to keep all four wheels on the road rather than becoming a motorbike like the Morris did, and back onto the sand immediately through the narrow street here, which is always a lot of fun with the buildings whizzing past either side. But yeah, it just gave me so much more confidence, this car in the corners. You can tell it's slightly slower on the straights despite that bit extra power, just because it is that little bit heavier, but it is really well planted. Although I did lift through there, which I didn't in the Morris. Got on a slightly funny line as we head down another. There's a lot of these sort of high-speed, straight, sandy bits through Playa Azul that I've used for this rally. This bit's quite nice and technical through here. A lot of it just crossing over roads, not really being on tarmac for any length of time. You want to be quite wide on this corner to get a nice run through here, but you don't want to hit that golf cart, which I did do when I was practicing. Slow down nicely through here. Watch the tyres on the inside. Those stripy ones are solid and will stop you dead, unlike the plain black tyres, which you can knock over. Again, another long, straight sand road, basically, along here. And on the brakes as we get towards the tarmac, a little bit wide here in the Porsche, but a lot smoother through this corner where I got the big kick of oversteer in the Morris, and across the road back onto the sand again, heading towards the beach, which is an interesting section to include in a rally, to have the sort of seafront here along the beach, but another high-speed straight section to get up to, well, almost three-figure speeds in most of the cars, I'm assuming, as we get back onto the slightly narrower bit of road towards the small village, which I don't know the name of, that says on that sign somewhere. Nice and flat through here, although very wide and nearly missing the checkpoint on this long sweeping corner as we head towards the nice relaxed straight bit of road towards the finish line, and across the line we go. And the Porsche sets a time of 2:49.820, so incredibly close to the Morris, which potentially is the advantage of, well, practicing the stage a bit beforehand. It means all of the cars have a much more representative time, but it's incredible how close these two were. Let's see what the Ford can do. So the Anglia is up to 130 horsepower after the previous cars being 113 and 109 for the Porsche and the Morris respectively. As we get going, this car is a bit of a handful through the corners compared to the other two. Much less planted, but it does have that bit more go on the straights from that added power. But yeah, it was a little bit of a challenge keeping this thing on the road after getting used to the other two, which, particularly the Porsche, which I ran just before this, handled very well. On the brakes here, the brakes didn't seem as good in the Anglia either. It also went slightly onto two wheels, slightly less spectacularly than the Morris did, but something about that corner does get the cars tipped up slightly. I don't know if it's if the camber goes in a certain direction. It is quite a tight one, so with a car with a lot of grip, I guess it does just want to roll a bit. Carefully through the centre of the town there, nicely through here, got that line better than I did in the Porsche, surprisingly. But it'll be interesting to see how the Ford does. The other two obviously being very close in time. It'll be interesting to see if the Ford can get near them, as it's slightly more of a handful, or if it's going to do better because it's quite a speed-based track. You can see I knocked over a tyre wall there because it was a little bit tricky keeping it on the road, like I said. Nicely through here, a bit wide there, but not too bad as we get back onto this bit. Another example of a high-speed section which will favour the Ford over the previous two. It'll be interesting to see how the Jag does, because it is up on power on everything, but quite heavy. But it might actually be able to get up to speed on some of these. But anyway, we're with the Ford at the moment, nicely onto the tarmac, through there, and cutting it quite close to that tyre on the inside, as we head down onto the beach, which is, like I said earlier, a very interesting segment. Quite different to anything we've seen in the previous two rallies, which were, if I'm honest, quite a similar backdrop. It's nice to get a bit of variety here with the sea and the beach. But yeah, this, of course, another bit that will favour the Ford's higher top speed down the beach. Probably getting over 100 in this, but I think I barely look at the speed I'm doing, to be honest. I'm looking where I'm going. Had to lift slightly here just because I don't trust it. And again through here a tiny bit, because I don't want to be missing that checkpoint on the outside. And then we get to the last straight bit of the track, down towards the finish, and across the line for the Ford. So the Ford propels itself into first place on this stage with a pretty impressive time of 2:47.751. So that added speed on the straights really did make a difference, and puts it in, well, more than a second faster than, 2 seconds, sorry, faster than the Porsche, and quite substantially faster than the Morris as well, those two obviously being very similar. But yeah, that added power clearly did make the difference. I thought it might. Let's see what our fourth and final car, the Jag, can do.
1, 2, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, rock. 5, 6, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, rock. 9, 10, 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, rock. We're gonna rock. Around 10 o'clock tonight, what is that?
And here goes the fourth and final run in the Jaguar. Up to 220 horsepower in this, so it is a powerful car. But as I've said in the previous two rallies, it is incredibly heavy, which is why it's possibly not done so well before. Now, the other three cars were all pretty similar. The Ford a bit faster than the other two, yes. But it'll be interesting to see how the Jag copes. There are some longer straights on this stage than previously, so potentially the power might come in a bit more useful than it has previously. Although I did particularly notice today how heavy this was. It might be because I'd run the course slightly better in the other cars. I did knock that over. The brakes seemed to be better than the other cars, or maybe I was just not going quite so fast. Felt very heavy through that corner, very difficult to get it turned in as we head down the narrow street of Playa Azul here towards the 90-degree corner at the end. But yeah, you can definitely feel the weight in this car. As I've said before, did go quite wide there, but we're going slow enough and the speed wasn't picking up very fast with all of that weight, so nothing really to worry about. It did seem to have very good brakes, but I don't know if, although I did overjudge them a bit there, kind of braked a bit too late, was a bit over-ambitious. Very wide there, don't know where I was going. Nicely up onto this bank to give me the best possible run through this chicane as possible, trying to gain as much time wherever I could with the Jag, because I know it struggles a bit. A little bit late turning in there. You have to be slightly careful of those tyres on the inside, which I've hit many times, so I'm always slightly cautious there. As we head on to this long straight section where I was hoping it would make up a little bit of time. But in doing so, I braked a little bit late into that corner, which wasn't really ideal, although seemed to get it all gathered up pretty well. As we go across the road and onto the sand again towards the sea. I was kind of hoping along here as well we'd get up to a reasonable speed in the Jag, but unfortunately I don't really have a benchmark for that because I wasn't really paying attention to the speedometer in the other cars. But I was looking quite closely in the Jag in the hope we could get it up to 3 digits along here, which I'm sure the other cars must have managed. But as we get into this narrower section, it did hit 100 roundabout here. But then I did lift going into the village, because didn't want to put the big heavy Jag into a wall. Slight lift here as well, get it tipped in. I think that it's actually slightly faster to lift there. just to get it tipped in better, even because otherwise you run wide and lose speed. Anyway, on to the high speed section, down towards the finish and across the line for the Jag. And sadly, despite the amount of power this Jag has, it is still a bit off the pace with that, well, amount of weight it's dragging around the rally stage, setting a 252.689. So the only car to drop into the 250s, which when I started practicing was the time I was getting in my practice car. So it is helping that I've done that. It's giving the cars all much more representative times, meaning the Ford, well, topped the board again like it did in the first week, which seems to be where it should be, and the Jag seems to always, well, sink to the bottom, apart from last week, which was a bit of an anomaly because the Ford went first and was substantially slower because that was effectively my first practice run. So yeah, it works so much better doing a bit of practice beforehand, which does make sense, and really I should have done that anyway, but gives much more representative times for the cars. Will be interesting to see what the Morris and Porsche do going forward though, because they were very close this week. So the winner of this week's stage is of course the Ford Anglia with its 2:47.751 time, nearly 2 seconds faster than the next car on the board, and over 2 seconds faster than the car in third, of course being the Morris and the Porsche. So that gives it 10 points for winning this week, like it did in the first week, putting it on a total of 22 after its slightly rubbish run last week, which was a bit of an anomaly because it was the first car to run and was kind of my first practice almost of that stage, which was a bit unfair on the poor Anglia. But yeah, it is now again in first place on 22 points. In second we now have the Morris, having 6 more points, well, because it finished second this week, putting it on a total of 20 points. In third, we have the Porsche, which previously was on the same points as the Ford that's now in the lead, with its 249.820, putting it in third. It gets 4 more points, putting it on 16 points in total, so is sitting in third place. And the poor Jaguar is back down in, well, it always was in fourth place, but it finished third last week, but its totals always put it in last. But with its rather slow 252.689, giving it only 2 points, meaning its total is 8, half of the next car up on the leaderboard, which is, of course, the Porsche. But yeah, the Ford is rather fast. Not the nice, probably the worst to drive, if I'm honest, the one I least like driving, because the handling isn't there, but the speed it has on the straights more than makes up for its slightly dodgy cornering. So it is looking like the Anglia is going to win this one, but we do have one more stage next week to, well, finalise where the cars go on the leaderboard, but it is looking like the Ford is going to win this one. But that is going to be all for this week's stage. So if you haven't seen the previous 2 stages, those went up at the same time the previous 2 weeks if you want to go and check those out. And I will be back with stage 4 at the same time next week. But for now, that is going to be all for today's video. So thank you very much for watching, and I will be back with the next video very soon.